Hello and welcome from New York. When the Berlin Wall came down, he played a concert at the site of that Cold War-era barrier. But what chance is there that Roger Waters, the iconic founder of the rock band Pink Floyd, might perform where the West Bank Wall now stands? The rock star has been a long-time critic of Israel's policies in the occupied territories, and that has brought him controversy and complaints from Israel supporters. Human rights groups have denounced it as a tool for segregation, and the International Court of Justice has ruled that its construction is contrary to international law. Still, Israel insists the barrier is needed to keep out Palestinian suicide bombers and claims that the country is safer as a result. Palestinians see it as a way for Israel to steal their land and humiliate them, and to protect Jewish settlers in the occupied territories. So today we ask, do walls really work? And we get Roger Waters' opinion on why the international community continues to tolerate them. Remember, you can email or text us your questions and comments. Joining me now is Roger Waters, who has visited Palestinian refugee camps affected by Israel's wall. He sees it as an echo of the sentiment expressed in his hugely successful 1979 album, The Wall, and has called for the barrier to be torn down. Roger, thanks for your time. Now, I'll get your experience of walls in the Middle East in just a moment, but first I was interested to read how you came across a quote of yours from 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, where you questioned the value of telecommunications technology, and you were asking whether it would serve to enlighten us and help us better understand each other, or whether it would deceive us and keep us apart. Now, you said at that time the jury is out. Watching what's been going on in the Middle East, seeing these countries, the leadership's autocratic and dictatorships, as people are calling them, falling, how do you regard that now? Is there any verdict?
Well, one hardly dares to be optimistic about these things, but it does seem as if the internet in general and sort of Facebook and Twitter in particular are accomplishing the end of allowing people, whatever their age and status might be, to communicate with one another across national and religious and ideological boundaries that was not possible before. So I'm horrified as I am by the bloodshed that's going on everywhere. I'm nevertheless encouraged by that fact.
Now, of course, you see the impact of music. You know the power of unity that can come from an iconic song, for example. Now, could you have expected social media to have this same kind of unifying force?
Well, yeah, and I said yes without thinking then, because I think at the time, if somebody had said to me, hey, look, I've got this great idea, it's called Facebook, and people send each other pictures of themselves and sort of, twit on about nothing to each other, and I would have gone, are you insane? I'm not investing in that. What a complete waste of everybody's time. So it just shows how foolish I may have been at the time. That's not to say that probably a huge amount of the time that people spend on Facebook is actually not socially constructive at all. It's just, it's sort of replacing gossiping over the garden hedge. But nevertheless, it has provided this extraordinary instrument that we are seeing taking hold. You talk about music. I just filmed a tiny clip 2 days ago for these kids called Blurred Vision from Canada, an Iranian group, or two of them are Iranian, I think, who had recorded my song Brick in the Wall Part 2, and they're relaunching it in conjunction with Amnesty International as a YouTube thing. So I did a, hey Ayatollah, leave those kids alone, and they're trying to get as many people as they can from all over the world to point their video cameras at themselves and say, hey Ayatollah, leave those kids alone, in order to protest the repressive nature of Ahmadinejad's regime. So that's extraordinary.
You actually have, more than 30 years on, you revived your iconic piece, The Wall. And I wonder what you see as its relevance to what's happening today.
Well, I hope you'll come to the show at some
to.
point. We're just about to go to Europe and do another 67 shows. So if you're in Europe, please come. The way the show is different than it was in 1979 is in 1979, when I did it with Pink Floyd, it was largely about Pink's personal story, and Pink's sort of 70% me and a little bit of Syd Barrett and a bit of a few other people from rock and roll. And I realized recently, before I resurrected it and put the new production together, that microcosmic story of that disaffected young man and his problems with whatever, political, sexual, emotional, whatever, could be seen in a larger way as an allegory for describing the way that governments and ideologies and religions react to and against one another, causing the enormous problems that we see for the people who live within those separated communities, separated as they are by walls of commerce and ideology and religion and so forth. And that is what my new production of The Wall is about.
And you said at the time when you wrote it, you were, quote, a frightened young man as well about it. Now, of course, 2 decades ago, the Berlin Wall came down, and it was, I mean, there was a huge symbolism with that as well, the fall of the Iron Curtain and the sort of East-West divide. Yet today we're seeing new walls being built. We're seeing what's happened with the West Bank wall, the Israel security barrier, segregation wall, depending on how people see it, and of course the Mexican border in the US. And I wonder, when you see, on one hand, an effort to bring down walls, and yet new walls going up, how you relate to that?
Well, as I keep, you know, restating throughout the show, fear builds walls, which is something actually that a photograph that my old lady took of the wall in Jerusalem, which had that quote on it, true as it is. And when we get frightened, that's what we tend to do. And when I say we, sometimes the fear can be real. And historically, of course, many cities were built with a wall around them. I read either on Al Jazeera or BBC, one of those being the 2 places I get my news from on the internet, that they're toying with the idea now of building a wall that encircles Baghdad. So Baghdad now is to become a walled city, as it probably was, you know, 500–600 years ago. And there's lots of complaints about the fact that the whole of the city of Baghdad is now, it looks like a maze. It looks like a sort of 19th century, you know, English maze in a garden somewhere, because it's completely divided by blast walls everywhere. And they're creating ghettos, so now the Sunni minority are surrounded by walls, and they have to go through passes to get in and out. And so that is extremely discouraging. But what you were talking about earlier, which is that we get at least to express the idea that this is not necessarily a good thing to one another, may in the long run help us to stop building walls at the rate that we are, and to tear as many of them down as we can.
Now, it's interesting, yeah, because you're referring to almost like these military walls. There's sort of green zones and things that are built as well when you get something like Baghdad, and this idea is kind of an interesting one. But I wonder, in summer of 2009, back in June that year, you visited the Aida Palestinian refugee camp. You went to Jenin as well, and that's very much affected by the large imposing wall there. What made you want to go and see that?
Well, I had been asked to do... I was doing a European tour and to go and do a gig in Tel Aviv. And I had accepted that. I signed a contract with the promoter there. And I was approached by Palestinians, a specific guy, Omar Bagoti is his name, and just sent me a very polite, nice email saying, listen, you know, we have this thing called BDS, which we're trying to promote, and we think that a cultural boycott of Israel would be a good idea, and we're asking you, and this was signed by thousands and thousands and thousands of people from everywhere, from Morocco to Algeria, to lots and lots of signatures from artists all over the Middle East, suggesting that I shouldn't do that. So I decided that I ought to go and have a look at it and think about it. So I went. And I was met by a nice American lady in Jerusalem called Allegro Pachero, who works for the UN there. And they took me to Aida, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but the refugee camp in Bethlehem. And we looked at the wall there. And we then also, because there was another initiative I was involved in, which was to help build a cinema in Jenin, right at the northern end of the occupied territories of the West Bank. So we drove all through the West Bank, went to Jenin and met with people there. And I was absolutely horrified by it. Not just by the wall around Jerusalem and in Bethlehem, and that goes right the way through Jerusalem, but also about the wall being built as it is to annex the occupied territories in Palestine and to make them part of Israel. So I decided not to do the Tel Aviv gig. I didn't go the whole hog. I did do a show in Israel, which I to some extent regret, but to some extent I don't. We cancelled the show in Tel Aviv, and we did it in a place called Neve Shalom in Hebrew, or Wahat Asalom, I think it's called in Arabic, and it's a agricultural community halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where they grow chickpeas. And the guy who runs it is a wonderful, wonderful man. The premise is that Christians and Muslims and Jews work in the fields alongside one another. Their children go to school together, and so they have at least there a generation of children who are growing up without the inherited hatred from the former generation.
I'm going to show something about that in a minute, but first let's have a look at a clip from the documentary Walled Horizons, where we see you near that separation barrier. We'll watch this.
I've written about walls, internal and external, during my career as a songwriter. They always engender in me a desire to understand the reason for them. The reason for walls is always fear, whether they're personal walls that we build around ourselves or walls like this that frightened governments build around themselves. They are always expression of a deep-seated insecurity.
Israel calls it a security fence, and I want to get your impression of what it seemed to be to you, and of course how you think it might have, or how you gauge it affected the psyche of the Palestinian people.
Well, you would have to say that if the Israeli government, on behalf of all the Israeli people, decided that in order to protect themselves from attack, they wanted to build a wall around themselves and become that walled city that we spoke about before, or in this case a walled nation, well then they should build a wall along the Green Line. They should build a wall along the, you know, on the armistice line, not the armistice line, but the 67 border. And one might put one's hands up and say, how sad is that? But if that's what they want to do, who are we to tell them that they shouldn't? But that's not where they're building the wall. They're building the wall for 900 kilometers all around the West Bank, and they are annexing the territory that they occupied in 1967. And that is what the world community considers illegal, and that is why those of us who are against it are, you know, prepared to stand up and say, no, this is wrong. This is illegal, immoral, oppressive, repressive, whatever you want. So.
Your revival of the music of The Wall became controversial when you used imagery of a B-52 bomber dropping bombs the shape of the Jewish Star of David, the US dollar sign, I think a big corporation logo such as those of Shell and Mercedes. Why choose those particular symbols?
You know, I should give my apologies to the Dutch for the Shell sign, you know, and the Germans for the Mercedes sign. It just... I wanted to pick symbols that represented all kinds of different religions, but also in terms of Mercedes and Shell, the Shell sign, they represent the whole of the kind of oil industry, who by and large ride roughshod over any kind of ecological needs that the rest of humanity might have. And I think it's really important that those of us who care about global warming or the environment or so on and so forth express the fact that we believe that their need to pay homage to the bottom line in their business overshadows a responsibility that they should have to take care of the environment, because it belongs to all of us, not just the people who own the oil companies or the other big corporations that run the world. Mercedes is a different thing. I've got nothing against Mercedes. I actually own a Mercedes. I'm quite prepared to admit that. But it's a kind of symbol of the excess of luxury that those of us who have cash, and that means a lot of people in the Western world and the Northern Hemisphere take for granted, but that may be something that if we're to share out the wealth of this planet in a fairer way in the future, and hopefully in consequence create a world where there is less conflict and less people being blown to bits and less parents losing children and so on and so forth, we may have to be prepared to accept the fact that we may have to settle you know, for something less elegant.
Now, of course, you got controversy for those images, and the Anti-Defamation League commented that you had crossed the line into anti-Semitism. How did you respond to them?
Well, if you go to my website, you can see how I responded. I wrote what I thought was rather a kind of eloquent letter refuting what he was called Abrams or something. Because he hadn't actually seen the show. He'd read a piece in Rolling Stone, and he was responding to that. And it was just the fact that the $ and the Star of David were on the screen at the same time, where he was saying, oh, you're bringing up all the worst possible, you know, stereotypical anti-Semitic views of Jews and money, and, you know, it's Shakespeare all over again. And he didn't say that. but that's sort of what he meant. And in response to that, I said, it never even occurred to me. I have the hammer and sickle, I have the crescent and the star, I have the crucifix, I have the Star of David, I have the $, I have show. There's a ton of things dropping out. I'm making the point that we are bombarded by ideas, both religious, ideological and commercial, and that causes us pain. And it causes death and suffering and whatever from all of those things. And I'm very even-handed about it. I think they withdrew, kind of quietly licking whatever wounds they had. Not that I intended to. And in fact, I have to say this. I said in my piece, the juxtaposition of these symbols is entirely irrelevant to me, so I changed them. So in the show, I went, it didn't make any difference to me. I don't care, you know.
It's interesting because there are those who say it's possible to criticize anything in the world, but you can't criticize Israel. And there's often a backlash. We've seen journalists fired for a comment here and there and so on. And I wonder, as someone who's been a staunch activist in the situation with the Israelis and Palestinians, apart from that ADL situation, what sort of backlash you faced over the years?
Well, I'm about to face a bit more because I've just written an op-ed piece, which at the moment, I think they're called the International something for Middle Eastern Understanding or something. I'm trying to place with either the New York Times, I think, or the Guardian, or somewhere anyway. And it's actually me calling upon my fellow, I banged the mic, calling on my fellow musicians and artists to join the BDS campaign against Israel, because I've finally decided to put my head above the parapet. Enough is enough. They pay lip service to the idea that they want to make peace with the Palestinians, and they sort of talk around the possibility of a two-state solution. But in the meantime, they're throwing people out of their homes in the Negev, in East Jerusalem. They're annexing huge parts of the West Bank. So all this talk about is just they're quietly getting on with taking over the whole of the land, and what happens then to the Palestinians. And I'm really concerned about that, as was my father, interestingly enough. My father taught at St. George's School in Jerusalem from 1936 to 1938, and was very concerned even then, you know, before the war, before the Holocaust, before all of that, about what was going on in Palestine.
And he died fighting in Italy, I gather. Is that right?
He died at Anzio, fighting the Germans. 1944.
Now, you know, you talked earlier about the concert you did, and we're going to take another look at that documentary, Walled Horizons, where you were playing a concert at Neve Shalom. Let's listen to that.
I may be speaking out of turn, but I believe that we, the rest of the world, need this generation of Israelis to tear down the walls.
How did you gauge the reaction of young people in Israel to that separation barrier and even their current policies towards Palestinians?
Well, you know, there were like 50 or 60,000 of them at that show we just saw, and I didn't get to speak to very many of them. They were extraordinarily enthusiastic, even to songs like Leaving Beirut, which were clearly trying to make the point, you know, that we're all human beings. And that particular song describes an experience of mine being taken in by an Arab family in the Lebanon when I was a very young man and treated with the kind of hospitality that you might, you know, read about in books. The people, they were so kind and hospitable to me. There were one or two responses to that saying, who does he think he is coming here and telling us what we should be doing or whatever. However, I know from many Israeli friends of mine that there is a movement in Israel, not just restricted to young people, but a general movement that we never hear about in the United States of America, of refusing. Kids who refuse to join the army or who leave the Air Force because they disapprove of their country's foreign policy, but also many thousands of Israelis who believe that their government's policies are repressive and racist and colonialist and imperialist and wrong, and who are fighting against it. So any one of us from outside Israel who thinks that Israeli policy is wrong, we're not anti-Semitic, and we're not against Israelis. In fact, we applaud those many of them whose humanity transcends both their religion and any nationalistic fervour that they might regress to. I think we're all human first, and that any movement towards a nationalistic and jingoistic attitudes is a regression into something that is actually beneath us.
Interesting, because I was reading how you'd said that there's a fairly prevalent, quote, cynical view that human beings as a collective are incapable of developing a more humane, that's to say, kinder, more generous, more cooperative, more empathetic relationship with one another, and that you disagree. And I wonder what gives you that optimism, considering all you've seen.
I saw it in my mother. I see it in my friends. I see it in individuals and collective expressions of love all over the world by all kinds of different people who resist the temptation to lump themselves into one particular frightened group or another.
Roger, I'm going to put a couple of emails to you, if I may, because viewers from around the world wrote in. Just get some of these out quickly to you. One came in from South Africa, from Kamarin Peter, who wrote in saying, how do you respond to the notion that being pro-Palestinian carries an anti-Semitic agenda?
Well, it's nonsense. It's being pro-freedom and pro-human rights. We're talking about basic, fundamental human rights. So if you're against an Israeli policy that has a two-tier system, like, it's interesting that that comes from South Africa, like they used to have in South Africa, you know, before the fall of the old regime, the apartheid regime. Well, I'm against Israel for exactly the same reasons that I was against South Africa. It's a two-tier racist system. They have passbooks. They have to carry identity cards that say whether they're a Jew or an Arab. It's insane.
I'm going to put one more email to you from Bangladesh, from Dhaka, from Masihul Chaudhry, who says, Roger's solidarity with Palestinians resembles the way George Harrison and Ravi Shankar played for Bangladesh in 1971. His efforts will add to the strength of the Palestinians. A comment there. It makes me wonder, you played at the site of the Berlin Wall in 1990, after that wall came down. From what you've seen, and considering how lingering the situation has been, how long it's been lingering between Israelis and Palestinians, do you ever expect to play at the site of the former wall, the separation wall?
Well, wouldn't it be great to say yes? Yes. There you go. And you can call me an old fool, but these things can happen very, very swiftly. You know, there's a tipping point in all of this always. And I wouldn't want to say no, because that might discourage those people who believe in a peaceful solution. And I want to encourage that line of thought and encourage those people. And nothing would please me more than if, say, in 10 years' time, we can go. Okay, boys, come on, put the stuff in the trucks, we're on our way. It would be fantastic. It would be so moving.
Please do invite me. Roger, thank you very much for your time.
Not at all.
Talking with you. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on topics and post your questions and comments. On the next show, 1,000 women dying every day. That's around how many are lost to preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. We examine maternal health issues ahead of International Women's Day. Make sure you tune in for that. From me and the team, We'll see you next time.
Dum